Hey, so John, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm John Hawks. I'm Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Wisconsin in Madison.
My name is Razib Khan. I'm an Unz Foundation Fellow, and I blog at Gene Expression. And I guess the way we're going to do this is, well, first of all, I guess we should say that we're back again, and that's because probably the biggest paleoanthropological fossil find, maybe in the last 3/4 of a generation, maybe, is my estimate, occurred a few weeks ago, right after our last dialogue, so it seemed appropriate. I'm going to start out with a quick summary or a statement of what I think it means, and then I will let John, the professional, take over and criticize, critique, deconstruct, whatever, what I just said.
We don't do deconstruction here.
Yeah. Well, you're in anthropology, right, John?
That's right.
Yeah, that's okay. Anyways, so basically I read the popular press accounts, and I also read Tim White's paper and Owen Lovejoy's paper. I didn't read too much of the ones in between of the 11 I think they posted on the science website. It's about 300 pages, so, you know, readers are interested, or viewers, they can go to the science website and find them free. In any case, my summary is basically that 4.5 million years ago there existed a hominin which gave rise to both chimpanzees and humans, and that hominin resembled it resembled humans more than chimpanzees. That's the cutout caricature I got from the papers and their press release.
Well, I think that's a fair reading of the way a lot of people are talking about it. Yeah.
Okay, because the old stereotype is we are descended from ape-like creatures, and the irony here is ape-like creatures may be descended from human-like creatures, right?
That's, at least in some aspects. I mean, I hate to let it go too far down along because somebody's listening and they're thinking, oh, what are they going to really say, and this doesn't sound good so far. It's obvious that humans are not very much like apes. And in any gross aspect you want to look at, just looking from a distance at these hominids, they look a lot more like chimps than they do like humans.
Okay. And so I guess, well, they look more like humans than chimps. So, I mean, how sure are they that chimps are descended from these hominins?
Well, so here's the question. How do we tell? We know that chimps and humans have a common ancestor. We know genetically that it looks like that ancestor lived something like 4 million years ago, maybe 5 million years ago.
Yeah.
Is Ardipithecus it? Or is Ardipithecus an early member of our own lineage on the hominin line? Is Ardipithecus an early member of the chimp lineage? Going on the way to chimps? Is it something else, a side branch? And I think from a scientific point of view, the question that you really arrive at is, how would you tell the difference?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, anatomically, what would you look for?
Yeah.
Traditionally, in anthropology, we've looked at the teeth.
Okay.
Partly that's because we've got a damn lot of teeth in the fossil record. And partly it's because humans and early hominins, the Australopithecines, which we already know a lot about, have relatively distinct teeth compared to chimpanzees and gorillas.
Mm-hmm.
Chimps and gorillas, thin enamel on their molar teeth. They have great big canine teeth, and they have a canine premolar cutting complex. So those canines the upper canines slice against the lower premolars, making sort of a scissor action.
Okay.
Early hominins, Australopithecines, they don't have that. They have very thick enamel on their molars. So these are teeth that are made for grinding. They have small canines, human-like canine teeth. They don't have fangs like Dracula. They have little short, puny canine teeth.
Okay. And
that probably goes along with this sort of grinding dentition. They're doing a lot of side-to-side motion in their chewing. Okay. Ardipithecus has hominin-like teeth in the sense that it has smaller canines than any living great apes, and it has thinner molar enamel than any known hominins. So it's got sort of this combination of features.
Okay.
It's thicker than apes. It's thinner than hominids. It's smaller canines than apes, really outside the range of anything but female bonobos, but bigger than humans, certainly, and bigger than Australopithecus also.
Okay, so you just gave me two independent characters. So if you had a two-dimensional chart,
Yep.
would Ardi be right between along a cluster or along a line? Would it be between the apes and the humans then?
In canine size, it would be between apes and humans, closer to humans. In enamel thickness, closer to humans, but between living great apes and humans. When I say living great apes, African apes, chimps and gorillas.
So that's the point then. It's closer to humans, and that's
closer to humans.
That's why Lovejoy and Tim White seem to be emphasizing that point. And
that's right. We call this a dental hominid. Looking at his teeth, we classify it with the hominids.
Okay. Let me go to the bipedality. Let me jump to that because
okay. I'll say one last word about dental hominids.
Okay.
We've had other dental hominins in the past because the bipedality comes into this point.
Mm-hmm.
There was an ape called Ardipithecus that everybody thought was the ancestor of the hominins.
Yeah.
40 years ago. Ardipithecus, something like 10 million years old. And so the idea was that humans diverged from apes something like 10 million years ago or earlier.
Yeah.
And because it looked like us in its teeth and lived in Pakistan, the idea is that human origins are completely open. You know, we could be related to orangutans, we could be related to anything.
Mm-hmm.
Miocene apes don't look very much like chimps and gorillas. And so it becomes a real problem. Yeah. Can we really tell from the teeth whether this is on our lineage or not?
Yeah. And basically it was genetics helped solve that, right?
Oh, genetics completely solved it. Genetics said, look, there's no way that hominins and chimps diverged more than maybe 6 million years ago. And so any earlier creature can't be on our lineage. It has to be something else. If it looks like us, it must have evolved those features in parallel with us. Mm-hmm. No matter what it looks like, this was Vince Sarich's words, no matter what it looks like, it can't be a hominid.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, okay, instead of going to bipedalism, let me jump to something that I was going to ask you. I listened to Owen Lovejoy, who's one of the researchers on the team. He seems to be doing more of like the theoretical analysis as opposed to extraction.
Yeah.
You know. So in any case, he has a really long article. That's the last article in this series. It's kind of like an end cap. In any case, he was asked on a radio show if we can know if this is our direct ancestor, and he, kind of like you, said, no, we can't know. So the idea here is this gives us a snapshot, right? This gives us a snapshot of evolution, and it doesn't matter as much if this was the ancestor of chimps or humans as much as it shows us where our common lineage was at that time, right?
Sure. If you want an analogy, imagine that you're driving, from Madison here to Green Bay on a really snowy day, like a blizzard, and people are going off the road left and right. And so you come along and you're looking from the air, and you can see where the cars are off the road. You can see the cars, but the snow is covering the road. You can't see where the road is. All you see is the tops of these cars. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, how do you tell where the road is? Now, between here and Green Bay, it's a long ways, and it's unlikely that cars have slid 300 miles off the road. So you can sort of tighten up.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
But the fossils are like that. They've come off of the main line, maybe to some extent. We can't tell if they're in the gene pool that led directly to us, but they're not real far from the gene pool.
Yeah.
And how far they are depends on how speciose that taxonomy was. How far do these things tend to slide off the main road on their way to humans?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I see that. But the thing is, it doesn't seem like that would make as good of a headline. I don't see it stated in that way very often. I mean, it made sense right. After I heard Lovejoy admit that. It made sense what he was trying to say. But I was a little struck that those aren't the top lines that you see.
Sure. Nobody wants to discover the earliest side branch.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to some extent, like let's say with mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited like along one line, there's the artifact that there's only one. If you go back far enough, there's only one lineage that's still around, right?
That's right, yeah.
There are limitations into that sort of, like, you need to be directly descended from anyhow. I mean,
That's right. That's right.
That there's more information out there than that, and a lot of, it's like, you just need something that's representative of a kind or a class or a category or a species or a genus or whatever, right? That's
right. When we're talking about the evolution of human-like traits, like bipedality or the teeth or, upright spine, the stuff that we look at, the brain, what we want to know is how these things go together. Which thing comes first? Yeah. What order did they happen in? Because that really constrains the hypotheses that could explain how they came about.
Okay. So in terms of order and sequence, can we move to bipedality then? Because
absolutely, yeah.
Traditionally, that's taken front and center in terms of understanding humans and human evolution and the causes behind our supposed uniqueness. It seems like this group in this paper downplayed it just a little by making it a secondary or maybe a consequence. From what I could gather from Lovejoy, he seems to be saying that bipedality was a consequence of some particular social structure, maybe male provisioning. Could you elaborate on that if I have it wrong?
Well, this is Lovejoy's hypothesis, and he's had this for now close to 30 years. He published this in 1981.
Okay.
There's a famous science paper called The Origin of Mankind, or Origin of something. And the reason why everybody in anthropology remembers it is because if you study the footnotes of the paper, he talks about promiscuity being possible in humans, and his citation for this is Don Johanson, Personal Communication. So this is something that students of anthropology always read, right?
Yeah.
But the basic idea is that what you have is a social model for why you become an upright walker.
Mm-hmm.
Darwin had a technological model. For Darwin, you walk upright because you want to use your hands to make weapons. And you're going to use the weapons to kill the animals.
Yeah.
So it's a dietary technological model.
Okay.
That doesn't work once you realize that bipedality occurs in these early hominins that aren't making any stone tools. So bipedality precedes technology.
Yeah.
And so at that point, the question is, what do you do to replace that model? Lovejoy's hypothesis was that bipedality, you're still using the hands. You're using the hands to carry food. And what was going on is the males would go out, they'd collect food, and they'd bring it back, and they would use that food as a kind of currency to keep females interested in them.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got this sort of formation of pair bonds connected to food sharing, connected to bipedality.
Okay.
That's the model.
Okay, and so I was wondering, so the savanna model, where bipedality emerged on the savanna, and we could stand up and look around or thermoregulate, I don't know, all those different theories, is that out of favor in anthropology right now?
Well, if we take the classic savanna model, what you've got is a hypothesis about energetics and predation. The idea is that you lived in the forest, but the forest has gone away, and it becomes patches of wooded country, and you have to move between these because hominids, like all large mammals, are dispersers. You've got to get from one place to another to find new mating patterns or whatever, and so you are going to do it from one patch to another. How do you do it? Energetically, and in terms of seeing what's around you, makes sense to be a biped because you're taller, you look like a more imposing figure cutting across grassland, and you've got an energetic bonus from not just supporting your body in a quadrupedal stance. But early hominins, talking about Ardipithecus aged hominins, something like 4 million years ago, they didn't live on the savanna. We don't find them in grassland contexts. And we've known this now for maybe 15 or 20 years. Everything earlier than about 3.5 million years ago is in a very wooded context.
Sure.
They're found along with monkeys. They're living in the woods. So the model where they're forced by climatic change to do this for energetic and reasons of predation doesn't seem to work.
Okay. I mean, whatever theory you have, if bipedality predates that, obviously that can't be the primary push then, right?
Yeah, exactly right. If you find out that they're bipeds first and the cause comes later, this is classic logic, right? The cause ought to come before the consequence. But how much before? I mean, with Lovejoy's idea, I think right now we have a real legitimate question about whether this canine size change, the one that he thinks reflects social structure, is way earlier than the change in locomotion. Because Ardipithecus was not an obligate biped in the sense that later hominins were.
Yeah, so I don't know how detailed we want to get, but something to do with the pelvis indicates that, right?
Well, when you look at the first thing is they've got toes that look like chimpanzee toes, right? They're grasping feet. That doesn't work real well if you want to be a biped. I mean, it works. You can sort of walk along with grasping feet. If you buy Halloween feet and walk around with ape feet, you can do it. But it's changing it's an early change, we would think, in the anatomy of the foot. If you became an obligate biped, that you would develop a big toe in line with the other toes, larger, capable of a toe off, because that's the main propulsion that you have when you're walking bipedally. Ardipithecus had bent leg gait. The features that we look at in the leg that say that they're supporting it straight. Now, bent leg gait is very inefficient because you're supporting your body with muscles all the time. Our gait is very efficient in the sense that our legs are like columns. When you stick them under our bodies and stand on them, they're supporting our weight like a column with very little muscular effort on our part. If we had to bend our leg all the time, I get my students to do this in class, walk around like a chimp, and it's hard. This is fitness time because you're building those leg muscles that way. Ardipithecus was not like a hominin in this respect.
Let me, as you're describing it, I'm almost thinking the stereotypical, quote, caveman gait.
Oh, sure.
Would that be accurate? Okay.
Yeah,
so Neanderthals did not walk
cavemen.
that way.
Cavemen never really walked that way because it would be terrible. And chimpanzees don't when they can help it.
The way you're describing it. I mean, I've seen, when I see them, the depictions, or we see the skeleton depiction, it looks really awkward. Yeah, but that's because I'm obviously, people haven't seen me walking around obviously in this format, but I am a biped. I know how it works, and it's just like it doesn't look right. It doesn't. So it's kind of like in terms of locomotion. Is it kind of a generalist because it doesn't have opposable thumbs?
We think, I'm looking at this in terms of a generalist. Yeah. It is not a knuckle walker.
Okay.
Knuckle walkers and orangutans, who are not knuckle walkers but suspensory also, they have these really, really long fingers and very short thumbs, and the finger tendons, the tendons that curve the fingers when you're grabbing onto, say, branches and hanging off of them, they're very strong. So you can't bend the hand back at the wrist to become a palm walker. You have to keep those fingers curled, and that's why chimps and gorillas are knuckle walkers. Ardipithecus was not like this. They didn't have chimp dimensions, but they didn't have human dimensions in their hands either. They had longer fingers than ours, shorter than chimps. Thumbs about the same length as ours, which compared to their fingers then become relatively shorter. But we'd call that a generalized hand. I mean, these guys would have been capable of walking on their palms or of using their hands to walk quadrupedally in trees, potentially on the ground. Their arms and legs are the same length. They could have been effective terrestrial quadrupeds.
So in some ways, I guess you can imagine, let's just presume that the chimp lineage and the human lineage come from Ardipithecus, or it's related cluster of species. It's as if, in terms of locomotion, we've gone in different specialized directions. Would that be?
That's exactly right. The chimp anatomy and the gorilla anatomy, they're very specialized for knuckle walking in their wrists, and they're very specialized for suspension in the forms of their fingers and in their lower backs. And those specializations, which really look like each other, it now appears that those occurred in parallel. Looks like that occurred twice in those two lineages because the ancestral form would have been more generalized.
Yeah, gorillas would predate the Ardipithecus. Correct.
Yeah, the gorilla divergence we would think would be about something like 7 million years ago.
Yeah. So what you're seeing in these two great ape lineages are, as you said, they're parallel, independent. I mean, would that be homoplasy?
That's exactly right. Yeah,
Okay.
It would be parallel evolution.
Yeah. So basically, it's not derived trait from a common ancestor, where it's indicating some sort of lineal, genetic relationship of how close they are. It's just an adaptation to the local environment.
Yeah, and that makes life tricky, because if we want to talk about, now it's very exciting, because we can, by comparing their genomes, potentially find out why these parallelisms happened.
Yeah.
We can look at the genetic causes of this now, I think. But in terms of just interpreting anatomy, it becomes very complicated, because how would we tell if Ardipithecus was an early member of any of these lines, if it's really generalized in its anatomy, if this is what the ancestor looked like?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's true. Because you need in terms of like figuring out descent, phylogenetically, you need specialized or special characters that allow you to trace the descent, right? Derived
That's
characters.
Right. Yeah.
And if there's not much derived, if it's just a general, just relatively a generic ape, it's hard to relate it to other things because it doesn't have special marks.
Yeah, so that's right.
Okay.
That's why some of the pelvic features that maybe look like they're better at standing upright, even if they're not a full obligate biped like we are, if they're a little better at it, maybe that's pointing in the hominin direction. And I think that's how the research team has interpreted it. They're in the hominin direction. They're in the hominin direction in terms of canine anatomy. That would be their argument, that the social changes that underlay early hominin divergence from chimps and gorillas, those must have been already present in Ardipithecus. That's the way that they're interpreting it.
Yeah. In terms of traits, there is one trait I want to get to that I want to reiterate. Their cranial capacity is about 300 cc's, right?
That's right, yeah.
In the chimpanzee range.
Yeah. Female chimpanzee range. Yeah. And I think that's interesting, because the Ardi skeleton is bigger than a male chimp's on average.
Okay. So in some ways, okay. So encephalization, like, the increase in brain size might have even occurred among chimps.
Could be. Yeah, it could be. I wouldn't go real far out on a limb about it with one specimen. We could be wrong about the body weight. We could be wrong about the brain size. But, if you had to make a call based on one specimen, you'd say, these guys have small brains.
Okay, in terms of the numbers of specimens, I was wondering about that. So there's one really complete specimens, but they have fragments of others, right?
That's right. There's all kinds of teeth.
Yeah.
To talk about more than 100 specimens, I think the number's around 120, and that represents more than 36 individuals.
36. Okay, yeah. So I heard Lovejoy say, again on the radio, that, or maybe I read it, that he used 7 specimens to estimate or infer sexual dimorphism. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, so
they've got, I think, 7 separate canines where they've got the same tooth and can compare the same shape.
So, in the text of his article, Lovejoy says, in terms of assumptions about sexual dimorphism, say among Australopithecines, that's really subject to problems of representativeness.
Yeah,
I think they're mixing and matching different species of Australopithecines and whatnot. I mean, would you agree with that?
I think, Lovejoy has a very, we'll call it unique view. I wouldn't say it's out, it's not like extraplanetary view, but he has a unique view of sexual dimorphism in early hominins. He could be right. Yeah, he's got an argument for why they're not as dimorphic as most of us assume. But I have to say that argument is based on some statistics that are, they're unique statistics. So I think it's a legitimate argument. The fact is that the kind of information that we really want to have is information that we don't have. We don't have complete skeletons of early hominins. And so you have to sort of triangulate based on, you've got the head of a femur here and the distal end of a humerus there, and how do those relate to body size in Lucy, the best complete skeleton we've had up to this time. And if you triangulate in a certain way, you say, well, really, they're not all that variable. Yeah. But, you triangulate in a different way, and you say that these are really impressively different. I don't have any strong opinion about this.
So in terms of Ardipithecus, would you say that the seven skeletons or specimens that he used to peg sexual dimorphism, those were pretty complete or complete enough for his task?
I think that people will be arguing about this for 20 years. Okay. I think it's exactly the same situation as with Australopithecus, except with less data. And so...
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, because he was kind of... So in the text, he seemed to be really skeptical about the quality of the data to calculate Australopithecine, Australopath, sexual dimorphism. On the other hand, as an outsider, I didn't see how his own data was, that incredibly awesome either. Yeah,
it's 7 things. Ask yourself, I'm going to pick 7 people off the street, and even if you had their complete bodies, if you do dissections, not that I'm advocating this, but even if you had every piece of data about their body measurements, how representative are they of sexual dimorphism in Homo sapiens?
Yeah.
Well, pick the first 7 people you see and ask yourself, are they representative, are they not? Sometimes they will be. Sometimes they won't be, and that's the problem we deal with fossils.
Well, I mean, just like thinking about the normal distribution of height, I think
Yeah.
Around 5% of men are shorter than the average woman.
That's right. Yeah.
Just off the street, and so you have about like a 6-inch average difference.
Yeah.
With just 2 standard deviations. Anyways, statistically 7. I mean, you could see some strange things pop up.
Yeah, male gorillas are twice the size of female gorillas in terms of weight.
Yeah.
And when we talk about what is sexual dimorphism like in these fossils, the question is, can we tell the gorilla pattern from the human pattern?
Yeah.
And the answer often is no. We can't tell the difference between those patterns.
Yeah, that's pretty stark because, I mean, you're right. I mean, gorillas, I mean, even I know that gorillas have a huge difference. If we can't,
if we look at primates, look at the range of primates. They range in sexual dimorphism immensely among primates. And sexual dimorphism is a poor predictor of social characteristics. It correlates with them. But if you wanted to say, I've got a sexual dimorphism where males are 1.3 times the size of females, what does that mean about their social structure? It's a poor predictor.
Okay.
So for early hominins, we deal with that problem. These things are correlated. There's no question. But our ability to predict them on the basis of the fossils is poor.
Okay. So going back to Lovejoy's paper, well, I should say something about Tim White's paper because I did have a question. Just out of curiosity, I know that Tim White, he's a really accomplished scientist and he has, basically mad skills, but he did say that a lot of the other papers that claimed that hominids lived in a mosaic environment were just bad because they didn't do their analysis appropriately. They were mixing different layers or strata, I believe.
Yeah.
And he did it. I mean, it just sounded like he did a good job, or he says he did a good job, and it's not a mosaic, and it's woodland. There's a fair amount of water, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think? Just reading the paper, because I can't judge.
Looking from the standpoint of other papers in paleoanthropology. I'm not a paleo environment reconstructor, but I'd say that looking at the standards that have been set by previous papers, this is far and away more rigorous as an analysis of what the environment was like across this transect. What they've got is these 2 layers of rock that are laid down by 2 successive eruptions, and they're 1,000 years apart, give or take, and you've got this sandwich of environment between them. And they can follow this along about 9 kilometers in their field site, and so they have sampled at different localities along this sandwich, and they've discovered that some of the parts represent forest, or some of the parts represent woods. We won't call it forest because it's not like rainforest.
Yeah.
But they're woods. They've got monkeys and bushbucks. This is closed habitat. And some represent grassland, and there's this continuum, and they find Ardipithecus only in the woods. That's really cool. I mean, if I was going to spend 15 years on understanding the context of an early hominin paleo environment, this is really good work.
Yeah. So the waiting was worth it?
I think the waiting was worth it for that. I mean, that was really a nice piece of work that, the entire team was involved in. Identifying the bones of the fauna that are there, identifying the microstratigraphy, the little stuff, finding the vegetable remains, the fossil wood. It's all really cool. I wish that, more people would sort of understand how much we know now about this paleo environment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But then there's the broader question. All right, large mammals, they can be very specialized in the habitat that they use. But, even primates who are, sort of arboreal, they have some flexibility. And to make absolute statements, they only lived here or this is what they're best adapted to, it's difficult. Because natural selection might be, natural selection shaving off the edges.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, there's still a distribution.
There's still a distribution.
Yeah.
There's still a question, what is the critical thing? What is the thing that affects their anatomy the most? Is it the few times that they're on the ground? Is it their ability to compete in trees for food with conspecifics? Is it their ability to outrun the leopards? It's all kinds of things where you say they have to be optimized to this environment that we can reconstruct only a few parts of.
Yeah.
And we have a real tendency to say that the parts that we understand, those must be the important parts because we can test them.
Okay, yeah, so it's like the police officer looking for the keys underneath the lamppost sort of thing.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so in terms of the general theory, it's what I got from it seems like they're positing a social structure, and from social structure leads to bipedality, and then somewhere along the way we're leading through to selection driving increases in intelligence, likely due to social structure again. I don't know. I'm curious, what do you think about that generalization? The intelligence part, it seemed a little tacked on. In Lovejoy's paper, I'm a little confused as to what's going on. I think it's outside the purview of his time span, so I think that's part of the issue, right?
I think so. I mean, Australopithecus now looks like it had significantly bigger brains than earlier hominids. And so you look at that and you say, well, something happened. Maybe they're smarter. Could be.
Yeah.
I think that if we want to talk about what happened socially to underlay either bipedality or brain size or potentially diet breadth, because Australopithecus has a broader diet than Ardipithecus, it looks like. Mm-hmm. How do we account for this? From, sort of a null hypothesis science point of view, I'd look at it and say, gosh, I don't know. There's all kinds of credible alternatives for how these things go together. I would not want to go out on a limb and say that there's a consensus that X factor was most important. I don't think we're going to know that for a long, long time. Okay. I think that it does cause us to revisit some things about Australopithecus. There's something different about them besides the fact that they're bipeds compared to chimpanzees and gorillas.
Yeah, and the point you made that chimpanzees might, we'll see, wait on more data, but that they might actually have larger brains than this ancestor is interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
That's more parallelism or parallel evolution after the separation, right?
Yeah, and there's been exciting work on chimp and gorilla behavior and their interactions. They live in the same places. They're sympatric across a lot of their range, and they eat the same foods.
Yeah.
But they have these different fallback foods in times of stress. Gorillas eat more of the chewy leaves. And chimpanzees go farther looking for fruit and more sugary stuff. Chimpanzees eat more meat, gorillas very rarely. And there's this kind of it's a subtle difference. If you just measure how much they eat of different things, a lot of times it's very close. But it makes a big difference, apparently, to their social structure and to their anatomy. With early hominins, we might be looking at real subtle differences that have a very strong importance to their anatomy, or we might be looking at quantum shifts that have very little effect on their anatomy.
Well, so one of the things that I was thinking about, and I posted this on my blog yesterday, is we often use, it just seems scientists, whether it's anthropologists or even geneticists, like to compare humans to the great apes to get a sense of how we've changed.
Yep.
So, you look at let's do in genetics, you look at the genes where humans seem to have evolved, or, they have more substitutions. It looks like there's more evolution on those genes, more change since the last common ancestor between chimps and humans, and we're like, oh, okay, that's how we have evolved, from our common ancestor, and the chimps are just, the implicit assumption there as well. I mean, if chimps are an ancestral state, their ancestors, et cetera, and, there's some selection effects, I think, in selecting those genes of interest, or what jumps out at us a lot of the time, right? And I just wonder now that we see this gross morphological change among chimpanzees, if we need to reconsider how we frame those questions and, interpretive analyses.
Oh, yeah. Paleontologists use the comparative method. And what the comparative method sort of means in vernacular is it means that you take the fossils, which represent bits and pieces, and then you're going to find some other living species where you know a lot about it, and you're going to use that to put the flesh on the fossils. Yeah. And sometimes that works really well, and sometimes it illuminates for you aspects of the fossils you didn't understand before. Mm-hmm. You look at the early hominin and you say, you know what, a chimpanzee doesn't work for this. This is not the model we should use. There's this long literature in anthropology about what's the best model for Australopithecus. Is it chimpanzees? Is it baboons? Baboons are terrestrial. They're living in open country. Chimps don't. Is it, if we're talking about social systems, do we want to look at New World primates? Do we want to look at contrasts between sets of primates that are closely related species and are different in precisely one aspect of anatomy that we see early hominins and chimps are different? That's, real science comparative method in evolutionary biology, and we do it. But every time we apply something, we're making an assumption about its applicability. Chimpanzees are no exception. They're an outgroup to the hominins. They're not us. Yet, they've changed on their own lineage. Yeah. They're not identical to the common ancestor. So you look at them and you say, we're going to use them to reconstruct where we came from. We're going to be wrong some proportion of the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it looks like, the impression I get is Ardipithecus, it's more of a question than an answer at this point, right?
I think so, but it's an exciting question. It says, look at all these things that you were happy to assume 3 weeks ago that now you can't assume anymore. It will inspire a lot of rethinking, I think. I certainly think it will lead to new chapters in all of our textbooks.
Including yours.
We've got this stage of evolution now that whether it's the ancestor of all of us or not, or the common ancestor with chimps, it's something we know about. It's like turning on another streetlight.
When I read this paper and like some of the press releases, I thought back to a science fiction show from the late 70s and early 80s, British science fiction show, Blake 7, and there was an episode where they were on a planet and there were some ape-like creatures, and one of the protagonists was telling the antagonist, the female, I can't believe we descended from these creatures. And she looked at him and said, those creatures descended from us.
Yeah.
I just thought of that because there's a lot of differences, across all of the lineages from that common ancestor, but it is just interesting that this common ancestor resembles humans in gross morphology so much, and chimps and gorillas might be specialized. In hindsight, it makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, like Homo erectus spread across the whole world. Chimps and gorillas look like they're relatively localized. I mean, it's hard to tell because, you don't have too many fossils, or if any, but that says something.
It makes sense. But I've got to tell you that if we look back in the past, we have fossils of apes from earlier time frames. Mm-hmm. And we've got living orangutans who mm-hmm. diverged from us something like 12 million years ago. We've got living gibbons who diverged from us maybe 18 million years ago. Mm-hmm. And there are parallelisms between all of those apes mm-hmm. that aren't present in Miocene apes.
Okay.
And that's sort of spooky, because what it's telling you is that there's this predominant sort of bias toward becoming more committed to suspending beneath branches, more committed to maybe larger body sizes, more committed to specialization. And our lineage, somehow escaped this and moved off some other way.
Well, I mean, it could be the pressure of monkeys, right?
That's right. Monkeys are a big pressure because they're competing for the same resources and have a much faster life history. They're reproducing faster.
From what I know, monkeys have displaced the apes in a lot of their niches, right?
That's right, yeah. And by the Pliocene, even though there are still rich primate communities outside of Africa, in Europe even, those aren't apes anymore. Only in China, Southeast Asia, do the apes hang on. So there is a climatic and a biological shift that's happened that makes apes not so great anymore.
Yeah.
There are weird things like Ardipithecus, which is an ape that lived on an island when Tuscany used to be an island in the middle of the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
And it's terrestrial. And it shares many of the features, I think, with the Ardipithecus pelvis. I think that we're going to learn a lot about this ancient world of apes from this specimen also.
Okay. So, is there anything, I'm sure we could go on for hours and hours. On this specific topic, is there anything else you would like to say? Because I think, I have some other questions, but those were my primary ones.
I think those are the main points. And besides that, I want to get to India, because I'm curious what you have to say about this.
Okay. Well, first of all, the last thing I would say is go. I would encourage all viewers and listeners to go to the science website and read some of the papers. The first one and the last one, in my opinion, are relatively readable, even if you don't understand the whole thing. And since it's open access, there's no excuse. I really encourage everybody. So,
show a big response to this, because I think it's good to have them know that this is valuable for people, to be able to read the stuff.
Yeah.
And it's not, by any means, settled science. We will be questioning this stuff for years.
They put 300 pages out there, so, it's all free, so it's great. So on India, about 3 weeks ago, there was a paper that came out. The lead author was David Reich out of Harvard, and it basically had a relatively simple model of Indian populations that suggested that they descended or can be modeled as an admixture of two ancestral populations, which they labeled ancestral North Indian and ancestral South Indian. Mm-hmm. The ancestral South Indians are basically a branch, I would say, of East Eurasian people, rather distantly. If you put them, along the family tree, they're closer to the peoples of East Asia, even if distantly to those, say on the order of 30 or 40,000 years, than they are to peoples of West Eurasia, as, for instance, Europeans, Middle Easterners. The ancestral North Indians are much closer to West Eurasians, and there's a little confusion to me, just in some of the results that they have and some of the charts they produce. But it looks like you can almost think of the ancestral North Indians as just another branch of West Eurasians, nothing particularly special. So when you look at South Asians, Indians in general, genetically, you have this tendency of them being closer to West Eurasians, to Europeans and Middle Easterners, than they are to East Eurasians, to East Asians, for example, and Southeast Asians. But if you have a two-dimensional map that maps the components of genetic variation, they will be between the two populations, but 2/3 of the way to West Eurasians. Which, it's kind of strange, and this model can explain that, if it's a two-way mixture. And what the mixture is within them, they had 130 individuals, and I think they had about almost 20 populations on that order. They showed that the variance in their populations of West Eurasian, or of ancestral North Indian and ancestral South Indian, go from, in terms of ancestral North Indian, 40 to 70%. So, 40% North Indian or 40% or 70% North Indian. And looking at the populations, it looks like the tribal populations are more ancestral South Indian, and North Indian and upper caste populations are more ancestral North Indian. And I think the reason you have in most previous genetic studies showed that Indians are a branch of West Eurasian populations are the samples are derived more from the lowland or settled agriculturalist populations that are more ancestral North Indian. So that was a lot to throw out there. And I'm not even going to get into the technical issues of the model, because there's a lot of gnarly stuff in there.
In some sense, the technical issues are not as interesting, because somebody could say, well, I apply a different model and I come to different conclusions. I think that one of maybe the broadest point is that here what we've got is a study where they've genotyped how many hundreds of thousands? I mean, it's hundreds of thousands of SNPs.
Yeah, I think it was 300, something like that, yeah.
Yeah, on several hundred people across this subcontinent.
Yeah.
And it has, that's the wave of the future when it comes to genetic sampling.
Yeah,
we're going to be dealing with samples like this, where what we've got are hundreds of thousands or millions of genotypes taken from people across broad geographic regions, and it's sort of our job to figure out what happened.
Yeah, well, it's already happened in Europe,
diversity.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. They've got that in Europe.
You've got sample sizes that are pushing 1,000, and you have really good granularity. You can see basically the map of Europe just by the genes, because genes are obvious. Genetic variation is proportional to variation in distance to some extent.
Yeah.
There's some exceptions, and the exceptions to me are interesting, but
if you average across hundreds of thousands of things, you're going to pull out that geographic component as the biggest.
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, this paper didn't tell us anything new. We always knew that there was a northwest to southeast gradient, as well as a caste level gradient, genetically, and the directionality is exactly what you would expect. The thing is, I was talking to our friend Greg Cochran about this. There are the implications. Some of the implications out of this suggest that some of our models something has to be wrong somewhere, and I think you addressed this to some extent, not in this specific case, but generally. In anthropology, there's been an idea that pots, not people, move, whereas, say, before World War II, whole populations moved. Yeah. And this shift, probably has some ideological reasons, obviously. Something happened during World War II that made the whole idea of folk wanderings a little less popular, But it looks like that is just that people do move, right? So,
well, yeah. It seems like sometimes groups of people get up and move, which is something we know historically. It has happened.
Yeah.
This model of very gradual diffusion of genes doesn't work very well across the last 10,000 years. If you have to cram these events into a short period of time, diffusion isn't really enough to push stuff very far.
Yeah. Well, so this is the confusing thing with the ancestral North Indians. They're not just closer to West Eurasians than ancestral South Indians. They're very close.
Yeah.
It's so when I first posted this, I knew I would get a lot of, I guess you could say, interesting comments from Indian commenters, because there's a lot of political issues that go into the archaeology and population history of the subcontinent. Basically, in the 19th century, white linguists and ethnographers produced a model where India was civilized by Aryans that came out of the northwest from Europe. They were blonde warriors, and they brought civilization, and they created the civilization of India, and eventually they were Mongolized through and racially became degraded. Mm-hmm. So obviously Indians don't like that story, and Europeans don't say those sorts of things anyways anymore. But in India, that model is still very much in their mind, and so many of them, especially nationalists, have produced a counter model where it all starts in India, like everything. Everything starts in India, including the Aryans, which doesn't make any sense, because Indo-European languages, in terms of their most ancient common words, all suggest that these were groups that lived in temperate zones that had winters and whatnot. And if you read the Vedas, it's like reading the Iliad.
Right.
They're gorging themselves on cattle. They're getting drunk. I mean, it's just not typical, high caste proper behavior, so to speak.
Uh-huh.
So I mean, the fact that they're from the outside seems really, really evident. The problem I have with this, so if you read this paper, it goes in opposite directions. It seems to me that the lead author, David Reich, is suggesting that the Indo-Europeans, that the Indo-Aryans, had a very strong genetic impact, although he doesn't come out and say it. And there's a lot of
caveats. They never at any point say, what time they think this contact may have happened.
Yes, but the Indian
got a
authors...
reconstruction of two groups that they think contribute, but they don't really talk about the timing.
They don't peg the timing, so it could be any time. Yeah. But the Indian authors, they do have opinions that they didn't put in the paper, which we know because they're quoted in the Indian media, and unless those quotes are fabricated, what the authors in the Indian media were pegging the time at relatively old, because they were looking at mitochondrial female lineages, which coalesced.
This is precisely why this is so anthropologically interesting, right? Because there's this different viewpoint. Yeah.
And they were going to the Indian media, and there are titles that say, like, Indians are genetically the same, or the genetic unity of India. If you read the supplements, which are free online, which I suspect was written by David Reich, Reich is suggesting something totally different, which goes further than I would go, where he's showing that the ancestral North Indians are closer to many Western European groups than are a group that live in the North Caucasus who do not speak an Indo-European language, right? Mm-hmm. And so, it doesn't take, you don't have to, infer too far to show that he is suggesting that this is the impact of the Indo-Europeans. Mm-hmm. And again, the ancestral North Indians, they are very European-like. Yeah. They're not just kind of relatively European-like, they're very European-like. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to go into technical... I mean, there's a lot of confusing issues there. But I don't think that they're the Indo-Aryans.
Yeah.
And the reason I don't think it is, the Indus Valley civilization was probably not Indo-European. There's a variety of reasons, but some of the Indo-European words that are ancient describe animals that did not exist in the Indus Valley civilization, right?
Yeah.
So, and it was relatively extensive. It was pretty dense. I strongly suspect that I can't see how Indo-European, nomads could have genetically replaced the local populations to that extent. Because in Pakistan, we're talking 80% ancestral North Indian.
It seems amazing to me that you could sustain the hypothesis that they could. I mean, you've got this big agricultural population. Mm-hmm. And, you've got people that are coming in from somewhere else. It is hard to see a really radical genetic replacement at the scale that you'd have to have in this scenario.
Well, and I had another thought, too. We have enough ancient DNA to get a sense that, say, I don't know, that 4,000 years ago, when the Indo-Europeans were moving into Western Mongolia, that they looked like typical Northeast Europeans, mostly blue-eyed, rather pale. The frequency of blue eyes is way too low in South Asia for it to be that. Either blue eyes had to have been selected later. I mean, it's just, the math doesn't work out, right?
Oh, I see. This is a very interesting idea.
Yeah.
That you're going to use what you know about an ancient group from, more and more in the future, from directly DNA, because we're going to have genotypes for more and more of them. But you're going to say, here's what the ancient group was. And can that component explain this genetic thing in the present?
Yeah,
and I think that you're right. I mean, the Tokharians, they're not what Goldstein is talking about here for ancestral North Indian.
Yeah,
but
they're approximately the same time. They'd be out of the same movement. We know that those populations. We're pretty certain that they were Indo-European speakers. I mean, they were. I mean, so the thing is think about the population. Think about an admixed population like Brazil. Mm-hmm. And compare it to India. It seems from what I've seen, Brazilians are admixed between Africans and Europeans, but even they have a higher proportion of light eyes or light hair than Indians. Mm-hmm. And yet, when you look at facial features, you can see how a lot of Indians would be like West Eurasians, right? So the model has to be a little more complex. I did not see a comparison to Middle Eastern groups. Mm-hmm. When you compare, so one of the things that kind of has to be said is the European groups that they compared to were I think the Adigai of the North Caucasus, and then mostly West European groups, which unfortunately is a problem because if Indians are related to any European groups, usually you would say it would be East European groups, and I don't want to go into why, but there's some Y chromosomal lineages that suggest some possible connection, and also Iranian-speaking groups were extant in the Ukraine and whatnot. Yeah. Okay. And the presumed ancestral culture of the Indo-Aryans, called the Adronovo, was probably in the Volga region. So, in any case, that's where you would look for the commonalities. But they did compare the various Indian groups, various caste groups, various tribes, various language groups to Europeans, and it looks like the variation. It's the variation of the Indian groups is almost on a line. Yeah. As if they're mixed from the Europeans with ancestral South Indians, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The only problem is I don't think, they're not West Europeans ancestrally. It's just that, the ancestral North Indians were very close to the West Europeans compared to ancestral South Asian. This
is, people should understand, this is all about the frequencies of genes.
Yeah.
And can you explain the frequencies as a function of a limited number of independent factors? Yeah. And so when you say that it looks like it's a mixture of this and this, what you're saying is that if I were to plot a factor going from this to this, that accounts for the frequencies. It's not saying that this was an ancient group that picked up and moved out of Spain to go to North India.
Yeah, and I mean they say that there's a lot of caveats in the paper, to their credit.
Yeah.
I think they've firmed up a lot that we already knew. And there needs to be a little more firming up. So in terms of the timing, the bad news for Indian nationalists is, I just have a really hard time seeing how ancestral North Indians could be indigenous to South Asia and yet be so close to West Eurasian populations compared to ancestral South Indians. On the other hand, I also have a hard time seeing how it could be Indo-Europeans from Europe.
Well, I'll tell you what I would not have predicted maybe 5 years ago is the extent to which Neolithic Europeans are not like living Europeans.
Yes.
There's this tremendous genetic flux that's happened in the last 5,000 or 6,000 years in Europe.
Yeah.
Europe I use as an example because we happen to have these ancient sequences now. And so we look at them and say, wow, where did those people go? Even though anatomically, if you're going to classify their skulls on the basis of do they look European 5,000 years ago? Yeah, they do.
Yeah. There's a lot of confusing stuff, and we're wrong about a lot of things. I wonder whether
we're looking at that kind of complexity all over the place.
Yeah. Well, maybe you could make up some weird model where the ancestral North Indians are actually the ancient Europeans that were eventually replaced in Europe.
Who knows? Although I think we'd be able to figure it out, right?
Yeah, that's the sort of thing, though, that's confusing. What I was thinking is Middle Eastern populations, especially Iranian populations, Anatolian populations, would be interesting to me because there are some suggestions that are very speculative that the ancient language of Elam, which is in southwest Iran, right across from the border from Iraq, that language, that group Elamite might be a Dravidian language, and there is a Dravidian language in Pakistan. So if I had to bet, I would say the ancestral North Indians might have brought Dravidian languages, not Indo-European languages. That might be a later overlay.
Okay.
There are things in India that suggest some sort of connection to Central Eurasia. For example, the milk digestion, lactase persistence.
Yeah.
One of those genes is the European Central Eurasian variant that's relatively common in North India. So I mean, for Indians who want their ancestors to be Aryans, and there's a lot of them out there.
Well, some of them are, I suppose.
Yeah, you could figure that out too. It's more. I mean, Reich. I mean, I'm assuming he did most of the writing in there. Does say that it's probably more complicated. I think he does say it's probably more complicated than that, the simple model. But, I mean, those later models, I think we need larger sample sizes and more representative populations to squeeze some more juice out of, say, like a three-way model instead of,
I think it's so interesting because you do a giant study like this, which is, just 4 orders of magnitude more information than you had about any of these populations genetically 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And
crazy.
Still, you can't say that you've really answered the questions.
Sure.
You've raised new ones.
It's an interesting. We're in an interesting transient.
Yeah.
Right. We're at a point where the old answers. We have enough data that the old answers are no longer satisfactory, but I don't think we have enough data that new answers are, or we can select from the new answers.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting time to be alive, and unfortunately for people that have ideological preferences about these sorts of things, I have a really hard time giving people a straight answer.
Yeah.
So they don't know whether to be angry with me or, to think I'm on their side. I mean, that's just one of the things. With this paper, that really came out because I didn't give anybody really a satisfactory answer because I don't have a satisfactory answer myself. I have more questions. There's a lot of things that we know are not true.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of things that still could be true out of the sample space, and
I
that's
think
what's
you're
going
right.
on with that.
Yeah.
I mean, we need. I mean, some of these studies they need to just include, basically more representative populations, right? I mean, that's part of the issue. It's not even the sample size.
And more people, and more ancient people. I'll tell you, we could learn more from one Neolithic skeleton than we can from sampling, 150 people living today. Just on the basis of what genes were there. And so this information that we're getting about the past in Europe so far, but I'm sure we'll get it from other places before long.
Yeah. Hopefully we will.
Yeah.
Hopefully we will. I mean, Europe's interesting, but I'm a little Europe.
Europe's
out.
interesting, but it's peripheral.
Yeah.
It's its own story that
Sure.
doesn't have to bear a strong connection to the main currents of Eurasian history.
It's as if we knew a lot about the phylogeography of Patagonia.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I mean, it's just out there, and it's, obviously it's had a huge outsized impact, but, I mean, genetically, there's a lot more out there. I mean, India is somewhat more complex, I think, just because I do buy the theory that it's probably the second most diverse area outside of Africa, just because it's been a refugia.
I think so, too. I mean, I think that's the picture that we're getting, certainly from mitochondrial DNA. And there's no reason to doubt it from a nuclear point of view right now.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I suggested, I think, was it could be the basic everybody outside of Eurasia is predominantly derived from ancient Indians, but those people later came back, and that gets kind of confusing to explain to people because they like to have a simple linear sequence where there's no back migration or reversal of what you just said.
Yeah. We're dealing with theories that are already 4 or 5 orders of complexity above. I get people who are confused about out of Africa. We came out of Africa.
Exactly.
Well, does that mean
That's
that we
easy
were Homo
peasy.
erectus? Well, then there was another, thing that maybe had a big impact, and it's complicated.
Yeah.
And going up to the last 10,000 years, which I think of as very recent history, that's ancient history to most people, that's, you've got all kinds of possible fluxes and returns, and
it's gonna be like War and Peace when the book of human human genetic history is it's gonna be many volumes of War and Peace. It's gonna be crazy. I mean, the rate of increase still seems like it's increasing of publication just because the it's getting cheaper to do the analysis and all that. But in any case, so I think we're at an hour, and I don't think we're that much over, so we should probably stop now.
I think that's great, and we've drawn out the commonality between these two very different temporal things, is that both of us really are thinking this is an exciting time, because it just, totally reframes what we have been thinking of in the past.
And you need more data, more representatives, more sample size, more samples. I mean, you can never have too many samples, right? I mean, I know in statistical power, eventually you get diminishing returns, but still, I mean, we're not there. We're not there.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Anyhow, well, I mean, I would not be surprised if we talk at some point in the future, John, because, you can't predict. So,
that's right.
Hopefully, take it easy.